somewhere beneath the western Pacific Ocean, roughly 200 kilometers southwest of the island of Guam, there is a place on Earth that has more in common with the moons of Jupiter than with any landscape you have ever walked across. The temperature sits just above freezing. The pressure would crush a tank. No light has reached it in all of recorded history, and likely none has reached it for as long as the feature has existed. The creatures that live there produce their own cold, chemical glow, drifting through a blackness so complete that it erases the very concept of direction. There is no up or down in the way we understand it. There is only weight, the weight of nearly 11 kilometers of salt water, pressing inward from every direction, compressing everything beneath it into a state of existence that the surface world has no equivalent for. This place is the Mariana Trench, and it is, by almost any meaningful measure, the most alien environment on the planet we call home. We use the word alien casually. We apply it to unusual foods, to unfamiliar customs, to landscapes that look a little different from what we are used to. But the Mariana Trench earns the word in its fullest, most unsettling sense. The conditions at the bottom of this trench are so far removed from the conditions at the surface that the organisms living there might as well be from another world. Their bodies are built differently. Their chemistry operates on different principles. Their senses detect stimuli that our bodies cannot perceive. They exist in an environment where the fundamental physical parameters, pressure, light, temperature, food supply, are so radically different from the surface that survival there requires a complete reinvention of biology, not a modification, not an adaptation in the gentle, incremental sense, a reinvention from the molecular level upward of what it means to be alive. The trench stretches roughly 2,550 kilometers in a crescent arc across the Pacific floor. Its width averages about 69 kilometers. Its depth, at the point called the Challenger Deep, reaches approximately 10,935 meters. To appreciate this number, consider that the cruising altitude of a commercial aeroplane is roughly 10,000 meters. The Challenger Deep is deeper than that altitude is high. If you could somehow stand at the bottom of the trench and look up through clear water, you would be gazing up through a column of ocean, taller than the flight path of every passenger jet crossing the sky above you. The pressure at that depth exceeds 1,100 atmospheres. Every square centimeter of surface bears more than a metric ton of force. The darkness is absolute, the cold is perpetual, and something is alive down there. Many things are alive down there. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why the Mariana Trench is not merely deep water but a genuinely alien world. Why the organisms that inhabit it have rewritten the rules of biology, and why some scientists now believe that studying the trench may be the best preparation we have for recognizing life on other worlds. You are going to learn what happens to matter, to two machines, and to living tissue at 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. You are going to see how creatures without eyes navigate a world without light, how organisms without stomachs feed in a world without food, and how life persists in conditions that should, by every calculation we can make, be fatal. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The Mariana Trench is not a place that reveals itself willingly. Every piece of knowledge we have about it has been extracted at enormous cost, through engineering that pushes the limits of human capability, through expeditions that risk millions of dollars of equipment with every descent, and through the painstaking analysis of data that is fragmentary, ambiguous, and often contradicted by the next expedition's findings. The trench guards its secrets behind a wall of pressure that our strongest machines can barely endure. And the secrets it guards are not trivial. They concern the fundamental nature of life itself, the boundaries of biology, and the possibility that the deepest, darkest, most hostile environment on our own planet may hold the key to understanding whether life exists elsewhere in the cosmos. Consider one final detail before we go deeper. More human beings have stood on the surface of the moon than have ever reached the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The moon is approximately 384,000 kilometers from Earth. The Challenger Deep is approximately 11 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific. We have crossed the vastly greater distance more often and more successfully than we have crossed the lesser one. The reason is not a lack of ambition or curiosity. The reason is physics. The pressure at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is, in practical engineering terms, one of the most difficult forces on the planet to design against. It is a force that does not merely resist our machines. It searches for their weaknesses, finds every microscopic flaw, and destroys them from the inside out. The void of space is hostile, but it is a predictable hostility. The pressure of the deep ocean is hostile and relentless, and it grows stronger with every meter of descent. What lives at the bottom of this trench, how it survives, and what it tells us about the nature of life are questions that have occupied scientists for more than a century. The answers, as they have slowly emerged from the darkness, have been stranger, more profound, and more unsettling than anyone predicted. Now, let us begin. To understand why the Mariana Trench deserves to be called an alien environment, it is necessary to understand how profoundly the conditions there differ from the conditions at the surface. The difference is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. The physical environment at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is so fundamentally different from the surface that an organism adapted to one could not survive in the other. A human being placed at the bottom of the Challenger Deep would be killed instantly by the pressure. An amphipod adapted to 1,000 atmospheres, brought to the surface, would die as its cells expanded and its proteins unfolded in the sudden absence of the force that held them together. The two environments are as incompatible as land and vacuum, as water and fire. They share a planet, but they share almost nothing else. The ocean is divided into zones, each defined by a set of physical conditions that determine what can live there. The boundaries between these zones are not sharp lines drawn on a map. They are gradual transitions, marked by changes in light, temperature, pressure, and biological composition that accumulate as depth increases. But the cumulative effect of these changes is dramatic. By the time you reach the Haddle Zone, the deepest layer of the ocean, the environment has been transformed so completely that it bears no resemblance to the surface. The first zone, the epipelagic, extends from the surface to roughly 200 meters. This is the sunlight zone, the layer of ocean that most people picture when they think of the sea. It is warm, bright, and crowded with life. Phytoplankton thrive here, converting sunlight into chemical energy through photosynthesis and forming the base of nearly every marine food chain. Coral reefs build their intricate structures in shallow epipelagic waters. Schools of tuna, pods of dolphins, and the great baleen whales move through this layer, feeding, breeding, and migrating along routes that span entire oceans. An estimated 90% of all marine life is found in this zone. The water temperature ranges from roughly 25 degrees Celsius in tropical regions to near freezing in polar waters. The pressure is low, ranging from 1 atmosphere at the surface to about 20 atmospheres at 200 meters. The light is abundant, filtering down through the water in shifting columns that illuminate the world in shades of blue and green. Below the epipelagic lies the mesopelagic, the twilight zone, from 200 to 1,000 meters. Here the light begins to fail. At 200 meters, there is still enough illumination to see by, a faint, diffused blue that casts the world in monochrome. By 500 meters, the light has faded to a level that human eyes barely detect. By 1,000 meters, it is gone entirely. The organisms in this zone have adapted to the diminishing light in ways that seem almost theatrical. Bioluminescence, the production of light through internal chemical reactions, is nearly universal here. Lanternfish, the most abundant vertebrates on the planet by total biomass, carry rows of tiny light-producing organs called photophores along their flanks. Hatchetfish produce a downward-facing glow on their bellies that matches the faint light filtering from above, effectively erasing their silhouettes when viewed from below. Dragonfish carry bioluminescent barbels beneath their chins, luring prey with flickering light in a world where any glow is a signal worth investigating. The temperature in the twilight zone drops to between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. The pressure climbs to 100 atmospheres. The food supply is already declining, limited to what is produced in the sunlight zone above. and what drifts downward as organisms die and sink. The bathypelagic, from 1,000 to 4,000 meters, is the midnight zone. Here, the darkness is total. No trace of surface light penetrates to this depth. The temperature drops to between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius and remains stable regardless of what happens at the surface. A tropical cyclone could be churning the upper ocean into foam, and at 2,000 meters the water would not register any change. The pressure ranges from 100 to 400 atmospheres. The organisms here are sparse, strange, and often nearly transparent. Anglerfish drift through the black, dangling bioluminescent lures from stalks above their jaws. Giant squid, their eyes the size of dinner plates, navigate by the faintest traces of bioluminescent light, hunting prey in a world where visibility is measured in centimeters rather than meters. The food supply is almost entirely composed of marine snow, the slow, continuous drift of dead organic particles from the surface, a faint, degraded trickle of nutrition that takes weeks or months to reach these depths and that has been picked through by organisms at every level above. The abyssopelagic, from 4,000 to 6,000 meters, is the abyss. The word comes from the Greek for bottomless, a name given in an era when this was thought to be the deepest part of the ocean. The temperature is between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius. The pressure exceeds 400 atmospheres. The seafloor here consists mainly of vast, flat abyssal plains, landscapes so featureless and so uniform that they resemble deserts made of clay. The sediment that covers these plains has accumulated grain by grain, particle by particle, over spans of time that strain comprehension. In some places, the sediment is hundreds of meters thick, a compressed record of everything that has ever sunk to the bottom of the ocean. The organisms that live here, sea cucumbers, brittle stars, polychaete worms, foraminifera, exist at the extreme margin of survival, subsisting on the last remnants of organic matter that have not been consumed by organisms in the layers above. Their metabolisms are slow, their growth rates are minimal, their lives are measured in decades. Time moves differently in the abyss. And then, below all of this, there is the Hadal zone, named for Hades, the Greek god of the underworld. It begins at 6,000 meters and extends downward to the very deepest points on the planet, just short of 11,000 meters. The Hadal zone does not occupy flat plains. It occupies trenches, narrow, elongated gashes in the Earth's crust, formed by the subduction of one tectonic plate beneath another. There are roughly 33 of these trenches worldwide, most of them concentrated around the Pacific Ring of Fire. Together, they represent less than 1% of the total ocean floor, but they are, without question, the most extreme environments on the planet's surface. The pressure at the bottom of the deepest trenches exceeds 1,100 atmospheres. The temperature is between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius. The darkness is total and permanent, and yet life is there. The Mariana Trench is the deepest of these trenches, and its Challenger Deep is the deepest point on the planet's surface. To fully grasp the scale of this feature, consider the following comparisons. Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, rises to a height of approximately 8,849 meters above sea level. The Challenger Deep descends to approximately 10,935 meters below sea level. If Mount Everest were placed at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, its summit would still be submerged under more than 2,000 meters of water. The tallest structure on the planet, inverted and sunk, would disappear beneath the ocean with room to spare. The pressure at the summit of Everest is roughly 1/3 of an atmosphere. The pressure at the bottom of the Challenger Deep is roughly 1,100 atmospheres. The difference is a factor of more than 3,000. An organism that can survive at the top of Everest would be crushed at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. An organism that thrives at the bottom of the Mariana Trench would literally fall apart at the top of Everest. The two environments are not different points on a single continuum. They are different worlds. A second comparison makes the point in a different way. The International Space Station orbits the Earth at an altitude of approximately 400 kilometers. The distance from the surface of the Pacific to the bottom of the Challenger Deep is approximately 11 kilometers. The space station is roughly 36 times farther from the surface than the bottom of the trench. And yet, We have maintained a continuous human presence aboard the space station since the year 2000. We have sent hundreds of astronauts to orbit. We have supplied the station with food, water, equipment, and scientific instruments on a regular schedule for more than 2 decades. In the same period, the total number of people who have visited the bottom of the Challenger Deep can be counted on 2 hands. The distance is smaller, the achievement is harder, because the challenge of the deep ocean is not distance, it is pressure. And pressure, unlike vacuum, is actively hostile to everything we build. The pressure at the bottom of the Mariana Trench deserves detailed attention, because it is the single most important factor that makes the trench an alien environment. Pressure in the ocean increases linearly with depth. For every 10 meters of descent, the pressure increases by approximately 1 atmosphere. At 100 meters, the pressure is roughly 10 atmospheres. At 1,000 meters, 100 atmospheres. At 10,000 meters, 1,000 atmospheres. At the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the pressure exceeds 1,100 atmospheres. This linear increase is relentless and inescapable. There is no shelter from it, no way to reduce it, no technology that can eliminate it. The only way to experience lower pressure is to ascend. What does 1,100 atmospheres actually feel like? The question is almost nonsensical, because no human body could survive long enough to feel anything at that pressure. But the effects on materials and machines are well documented. At 1,100 atmospheres, a polystyrene cup shrinks to the size of a thimble. The air inside the foam is compressed to near nothing, and the cup collapses into a dense, hard miniature of itself. A standard glass window, the kind used in buildings and cars, would shatter instantly. Mild steel would deform and buckle. Only the strongest engineered materials, titanium alloys, high-grade steel composites, specially formulated ceramics, can maintain their structural integrity at this pressure, and even these materials must be shaped into specific geometries, typically spheres, that distribute the force evenly across their surfaces. A flat plate, no matter how strong the material, would fail at Hadal pressures because the force would concentrate at the edges and stress points. Only a sphere pushes back uniformly from every direction, and only a perfect sphere at that. Any imperfection, any asymmetry, any deviation from the ideal geometry becomes a point where stress concentrates and failure begins. The darkness at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is equally fundamental to its alien character. Sunlight penetrates ocean water to a maximum depth of approximately 1,000 meters, and only in the clearest tropical waters under ideal conditions. Below 1,000 meters, photosynthesis is impossible. Below 1,000 meters, the visual environment that every surface organism relies upon simply ceases to exist. The Hadal zone begins at 6,000 meters, which means its upper boundary is 5,000 meters below the deepest reach of sunlight. 5 vertical kilometers of pure, unbroken darkness separate the last photon of solar light from the entrance to the Hadal world. The darkness at Hadal depths is not like any darkness experienced at the surface. It is not like a moonless night. It is not like a sealed room. It is more complete than either, because there are no sources of light at all, except the organisms that make their own. And in the deepest parts of the Hadal zone, even bioluminescence becomes scarce, because the organisms that produce it are few and widely dispersed. The temperature at Hadal depths is another factor that separates the trench from the surface world. The water at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius, a temperature that barely varies from year to year, from decade to decade, from century to century. The surface ocean can swing from near freezing to more than 30 degrees Celsius, depending on latitude, season, and weather. The deep ocean knows none of this variability. It is cold, consistently, permanently, and the organisms that live in it have adapted to this constancy. Their enzymes function optimally at near-freezing temperatures. Their metabolisms are tuned to the cold. A sudden increase in temperature, even by a few degrees, would be as disruptive to them as a sudden drop to sub-zero would be to a tropical fish. Stability in the Hadal zone is not a comfort, it is a constraint. The organisms there have traded flexibility for precision, adapting so perfectly to a narrow range of conditions that any deviation from those conditions becomes lethal. the food supply at Haddle depths is the final piece of the alien puzzle. Nearly all life on Earth is ultimately sustained by sunlight. Even the deepest creatures rely, in most cases, on organic matter produced by photosynthesis at the surface, which sinks through the water column as marine snow. But by the time marine snow reaches the Haddle zone, it has been sinking for weeks or months, passing through layers of organisms that consume, decompose, and repackage it at every stage. What arrives at 6,000 meters is a sparse, degraded remnant of what left the surface. What arrives at 10,000 meters is sparser still. The organisms at Haddle depths survive on an energy budget that would starve most surface creatures in days. They compensate with slow metabolisms, efficient digestion, and reproductive strategies that prioritize survival over speed. Some Haddle organisms may go months between meals, some may go longer. The concept of feast is almost foreign at these depths. There is only famine, punctuated by rare and unpredictable windfalls, when a large piece of organic debris, a dead whale, a sunken log, a mass of jellyfish, happens to reach the bottom. The combination of these four factors, extreme pressure, total darkness, near freezing temperature, and minimal food, creates an environment that is as different from the surface of the Earth as the surface of the Earth is from the surface of Mars. The organisms that live in this environment have been shaped by these conditions into forms that bear little resemblance to surface life. They are not variations on familiar themes, they are departures from them. They have abandoned the strategies that work at the surface and invented new ones, strategies that are so specialized and so precisely tuned to Haddle conditions that they seem almost engineered. The Mariana Trench is not merely deep water, it is, in a biological and physical sense, another world. The history of our awareness of this world begins in the 19th century, with the HMS Challenger expedition, which between 1872 and 1876 conducted the first systematic survey of the deep ocean. The Challenger measured depths, collected sediment and water samples, and catalogued thousands of new species. In March of 1875, while crossing the western Pacific near the Mariana Islands, the crew recorded a sounding of approximately 8,184 meters, the deepest measurement taken during the entire four-year voyage. This was the first recorded measurement of what would later be known as the Challenger Deep, and it established the Mariana Trench as the deepest feature on the planet's surface. In the decades that followed, echo sounders and other acoustic technologies refined the measurement. The Challenger Deep was found to be significantly deeper than the original rope-based sounding had indicated. By the mid-20th century, the depth was estimated at approximately 10,900 meters, a figure that has been further refined but not dramatically changed by subsequent surveys. The first human visit to the bottom occurred on the 23rd of January, 1960, when Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh descended in the bathyscaphe Trieste. They spent approximately 20 minutes at the bottom, observed what appeared to be a flatfish and a shrimp-like organism on the sediment, and returned to the surface. More than 50 years would pass before the next human visit, James Cameron's solo dive in the Deepsa Challenger in 2012. Since then, Victor Vescovo completed multiple dives in 2019, and Chinese researchers descended in the Fendouje in 2020. The total number of human beings who have ever reached the Challenger Deep remains fewer than 15. These visits, brief and scattered over more than 6 decades, constitute the entirety of direct human experience of the deepest point on Earth. Everything else we know comes from instruments, cameras, landers, and remotely operated vehicles. Tools that offer fragmentary glimpses of an environment that extends across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of trench floor. The scale of what remains unseen dwarfs the scale of what has been observed. And what has been observed in those brief, costly, hard-won glimpses has consistently defied expectations. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling, because the organisms that live in this alien environment are not merely surviving. They are adapted, they are specialized, they are, in their own way, thriving. And the adaptations they have developed to survive at Haddle depths are so radical so far removed from the biology of surface organisms that they challenge some of our most basic assumptions about the requirements of life. The geology of the Mariana Trench itself contributes to its alien character in ways that are often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic biological stories. The trench is a subduction zone, a place where the Pacific Plate, one of the largest tectonic plates on the planet, is being driven beneath the smaller Mariana Plate. This collision is not gentle. It is a slow-motion catastrophe of planetary proportions. The Pacific Plate descends at a rate of a few centimeters per year, grinding downward into the Earth's mantle, generating earthquakes, volcanic activity, and the immense forces that have carved the trench to its current depth. The trench is not a static feature. It is actively forming, deepening by imperceptible increments with each passing century, shaped by forces that dwarf anything on the surface. The walls of the Mariana Trench are steep, in some places nearly vertical, rising several thousand meters from the trench floor to the surrounding abyssal plain. These walls are made of exposed rock, fractured and faulted by the tectonic forces that created them. The rock is a mix of oceanic crust, basalt that formed at a mid-ocean ridge and has been carried across the Pacific by plate movement, and sedimentary material that has accumulated on the plate during its journey. As the plate subducts, these materials are scraped, compressed, and deformed, creating a geological record of extraordinary complexity. The rocks at the bottom of the Mariana Trench have been through a journey that spans the entire Pacific Ocean, from the ridge where they formed to the trench where they are being consumed. Their journey has taken tens of millions of years, according to geological estimates, and it is not yet complete. The subducting plate will continue to descend, carrying its burden of rock and sediment deeper into the mantle, where it will eventually be recycled, melted, and returned to the surface through volcanic eruptions millions of years in the future. This geological context is important because it shapes the environment in which hadal organisms live. The subduction process generates geothermal heat, which warms the rock and drives chemical reactions that produce gases and mineral-rich fluids. These fluids seep upward through fissures in the trench floor, creating localized hotspots of chemical energy that support communities of organisms independent of the sun-driven food chain above. The serpentinization of mantle rock, a process in which water reacts with iron and magnesium-rich minerals to produce hydrogen gas and alkaline fluids, is one such reaction. The hydrogen gas produced by serpentinization can be used as an energy source by specialized microorganisms, which in turn support small ecosystems of organisms that derive their nutrition entirely from geological chemistry. These are communities that owe their existence not to the sun, but to the Earth itself, to the slow, grinding collision of tectonic plates and the chemical reactions it generates. The shape of the trench also creates unique hydrological conditions. The narrow, elongated geometry of the trench acts as a funnel, channeling sediment, organic debris, and water from the surrounding ocean into the deepest parts of the trough. Earthquakes along the trench walls can trigger underwater landslides that send massive quantities of sediment cascading to the bottom, burying the existing surface and creating new terrain in a matter of hours. The effect of these turbidity currents, as they are called, is to periodically reset the biological clock at the trench floor, covering existing communities with a thick blanket of sediment and forcing the ecosystem to recolonize from scratch. The organisms that survive in this environment must therefore be adapted not only to the extreme baseline conditions of pressure, cold, and darkness, but also to the periodic catastrophic disturbance caused by seismic activity. They must be resilient, able to recover from burial, dispersal, or the sudden destruction of their habitat. This combination of chronic extremes and acute disturbance is rare on the planet's surface and adds another dimension to the trench's alien character. The water chemistry of the Mariana Trench is yet another factor that sets it apart from the surface ocean. The concentration of dissolved gases, including oxygen, carbon dioxide, and methane, varies with depth and location within the trench. The oxygen content at hadal depths is generally lower than at the surface, but not zero. Enough oxygen reaches the trench floor through deep ocean circulation to support aerobic organisms, though the supply is limited and variable. Carbon dioxide concentrations are higher at depth because the decomposition of sinking organic matter releases carbon dioxide that accumulates in the deep water. This elevated carbon dioxide makes the water slightly more acidic than surface water, an effect that is amplified at extreme pressure. The pH of Hadal water is typically lower than the pH of surface water, and this slight acidity can affect the shells, skeletons, and other calcium-based structures of organisms that inhabit the trench. In certain locations within the Mariana Trench, the water chemistry becomes even more exotic. Near hydrothermal vents and cold seeps, the water is enriched with hydrogen sulfide, methane, and heavy metals dissolved from the surrounding rock. These chemical oases are toxic to most marine life, but supportive of specialized communities of chemosynthetic organisms that derive their energy from the oxidation of these compounds. The chemistry of vent and seep fluids is complex, variable, and not fully characterized. Each site has its own unique chemical signature, determined by the specific geology and hydrology of the underlying rock. The organisms that colonize these sites must be adapted not only to the general conditions of the Hadal zone, but also to the specific chemical environment of their particular location. The result is a patchwork of distinct microcommunities, each shaped by local chemistry, each potentially harboring species found nowhere else on the planet. The scale of the Mariana Trench ensures that this patchwork is vast. The trench covers an estimated area of approximately 150,000 square kilometers, though precise measurements are difficult because the irregular, three-dimensional geometry of the trench makes simple area calculations unreliable. Within this area, the terrain varies enormously. Flat sediment plains on the trench floor give way to steep rock walls, which give way to fractured fault zones, which give way to volcanic structures and hydrothermal fields. Each terrain type supports a different community of organisms. Each community is potentially isolated from its neighbors by barriers of unsuitable habitat, leading to high rates of endemism, species found only in one location and nowhere else. The biological diversity of the Mariana Trench is almost certainly much higher than current surveys suggest, because most of the trench floor has never been sampled or even photographed. Three scaled comparisons bring the alien nature of the Mariana Trench into sharper focus. The first concerns time. Light from the sun reaches the surface of the ocean in approximately 8 minutes after leaving the solar surface. That same light, if it could somehow continue downward through the water, would be completely absorbed within the first 1,000 meters. The Hadal zone begins at 6,000 meters, meaning that the trench floor lies 5,000 meters below the deepest point that light can reach. In terms of solar illumination, the bottom of the Mariana Trench is farther from the sun than any point on the surface of the Earth, not in terms of actual distance, but in terms of the impossibility of solar energy reaching it. The trench floor is, in a very real sense, beyond the reach of the star that sustains virtually all life on this planet. The second comparison concerns the weight of water. A standard bathtub holds roughly 300 liters of water, weighing about 300 kilograms. The weight of water above a single square meter of the Challenger Deepwater floor is approximately 112 million kilograms. That is the weight of roughly 370,000 bathtubs of water, stacked on a surface the size of a dining table. The weight is so great that it deforms the rock beneath it, compresses the water above it into a measurably denser state, and imposes forces on any object at the bottom that exceed the structural capacity of virtually every material known to engineering. The third comparison concerns exploration. The total area of the Moon's surface is approximately 38 million square kilometers. The total area of the Mariana Trench's floor is approximately 150,000 square kilometers. We have mapped the Moon's surface at resolutions of roughly 2 meters per pixel using orbital instruments. We have mapped the Mariana Trench's floor at resolutions that, in most areas, cannot resolve features smaller than several hundred meters. We know the Moon better than we know the deepest part of our own ocean. This is not a commentary on priorities. It is a commentary on difficulty. The Moon is far away, but it is accessible. The trench is close, but it is guarded by pressure that our technology can only briefly endure. Then something happened that changed everything. Organisms began to emerge from the darkness of the trench, not in person, but through the instruments and cameras that scientists sent down to find them. Beginning with the crude sediment dredges of the 19th century and continuing through the sophisticated landers and submersibles of the 21st, a picture has slowly assembled of life at Hadal depths that contradicts nearly every prior assumption about the limits of biology. Each new expedition has contributed another piece to this picture, and each piece has been stranger than the one before. The organisms of the Mariana Trench are not merely adapted to extreme conditions. They are, in the fullest and most precise sense of the word, alien, and what those instruments revealed was not merely unexpected. It was, in the precise scientific meaning of the word, alien. The core problem that the Mariana Trench poses to biology is not that life exists there. We have known, in general terms, that deep-sea life exists since the HMS Challenger expedition dredged organisms from the ocean floor in the 1870s. The core problem is that the life which exists in the Mariana Trench should not work. Not by the rules we understood, not by the models we built, not by the principles we taught in classrooms and published in textbooks. The organisms of the Hadal zone have solved biological problems that, according to our understanding of biochemistry, should not have solutions. They have found ways to keep their proteins functional at pressures that should destroy protein structure. They have found ways to maintain fluid cell membranes at temperatures that should make them rigid. They have found ways to extract energy from chemical sources so meager that they should not sustain metabolism. Each of these solutions represents a departure from the biology we know, and collectively they describe a form of life that operates on different principles from the life at the surface. The protein problem is perhaps the most fundamental. Proteins are the molecular machines that make biology possible. They catalyze chemical reactions, transport molecules across cell membranes, provide structural support, transmit signals between cells, and perform thousands of other functions that are essential to life. Each protein's function depends on its three-dimensional shape, a precise folding pattern determined by the sequence of amino acids in the protein chain and maintained by a delicate balance of forces between the atoms within the molecule and the water molecules surrounding it. This balance is sensitive to environmental conditions. If the temperature is too high, the protein unfolds, a process called denaturation. If the pH is too far from the optimum, the protein unfolds. And if the pressure is too great, the protein unfolds. At Hadal depths, the pressure is far too great for most proteins. The force acting on the molecules is sufficient to squeeze them out of their native folded shape, pushing water molecules into the interior of the protein structure and disrupting the interactions that hold the chain in its functional configuration. A protein from a surface organism placed at 1,000 atmospheres would unfold rapidly and lose its function. The enzymes would stop catalyzing reactions. The structural proteins would lose their rigidity. The transport proteins would cease moving molecules. The organism would die, not from being crushed in the mechanical sense, but from having its molecular machinery disassembled by pressure. The organisms of the Mariana Trench have solved this problem with a molecule called trimethylamine N-oxide, or TMAO. This small organic compound, which is also found in shallow water fish at much lower concentrations, acts as a pyhazolite, a molecule that counteracts the destabilizing effect of pressure on proteins. TMAO works by surrounding the protein molecule and filling the space between the protein's surface and the surrounding water. In effect, it creates a molecular buffer zone that absorbs the force of the pressure and prevents it from reaching the protein's interior. With sufficient TMAO in the cell, the protein can maintain its folded, functional shape even at 1,000 atmospheres. The relationship between TMAO concentration and depth is strikingly precise. At the surface, marine organisms typically have TMAO concentrations of a few millimoles per kilogram of body mass. At 3,000 meters, the concentration rises to roughly 100 to 150 millimoles per kilogram. At 6,000 meters, the entrance to the Hadal zone, it reaches approximately 250 millimoles per kilogram. At 10,000 meters, near the bottom of the Challenger Deep, it exceeds 400 millimoles per kilogram. The relationship is almost perfectly linear. For every additional meter of depth, the organism produces a corresponding increase in its TMAO levels, as if calibrating its internal chemistry to precisely match the external pressure. This is not a rough approximation. It is a precise quantitative matching of internal biochemistry to external physical conditions, a feat of molecular engineering that our laboratories have not been able to replicate artificially. But here is the problem. TMAO at very high concentrations begins to interfere with other cellular processes. At concentrations above roughly 500 millimoles per kilogram, TMAO itself becomes problematic, disrupting the delicate balance of forces within the cell and potentially causing damage to the very structures it is meant to protect. Scientists have calculated that this upper limit corresponds to a depth of approximately 8,200 to 8,400 meters for fish, which is extraordinarily close to the deepest confirmed observations of living fish in the Mariana Trench. Below this depth, fish biology should not function, because the TMAO concentration required to stabilize proteins at greater pressure would itself be toxic. This prediction has been broadly confirmed by observation. The deepest confirmed fish, the snailfish Pseudoliparus soiree, was observed at 8,178 meters in the Mariana Trench. Subsequent observations by Chinese researchers have reported snailfish at depths exceeding 8,300 meters in other trenches, but no confirmed observation of a living fish has been made at 9,000 meters or below. The theoretical limit appears to be real. Fish cannot go deeper because their own biochemistry cannot support them past a certain threshold. The pressure is not merely high, it is biochemically prohibitive. The molecular solution that makes Hadal fish possible is the same molecular solution that sets their lower boundary. It enables and it constrains in equal measure. Amphipods, the small crustaceans that dominate the deepest parts of the Mariana Trench, have found a different solution. Their cells also contain elevated TMAO, but they have additional biochemical defenses that allow them to survive at pressures that fish cannot tolerate. Their cell membranes contain unusually high proportions of unsaturated fatty acids, which keep the membranes fluid and functional at pressures that would make a typical membrane rigid and impermeable. Their enzymes have been modified at the genetic level to function optimally at extreme pressure, with amino acid substitutions in key positions that make the enzyme structure more flexible and less susceptible to pressure-induced deformation. These are not superficial changes. They are deep, structural modifications to the molecular machinery of the cell, changes that affect the organism's entire biochemistry and that are not readily reversible. An amphipod adapted to 10,000 meters cannot simply readjust to function at the surface. Its proteins, its membranes, and its enzymes are tuned to 1,000 atmospheres. At 1 atmosphere, they would function poorly or not at all, and it gets stranger. The deepest organisms in the Mariana Trench face not only pressure, but also a problem of energy that makes their survival seem almost paradoxical. The food supply at Hadal depths is by any standard minuscule. The marine snow that provides the primary source of organic nutrition is sparse, degraded, and unpredictable. A significant fraction of the organic matter produced at the surface is consumed in the upper water column and never reaches the Hadal zone at all. What does reach the bottom has been picked over by organisms at every depth along the way, leaving only the least digestible, least nutritious remnants. The energy content of Hadal sediment, measured in terms of organic carbon per unit area, is among the lowest of any ocean floor environment. The organisms that live on this sediment must extract usable energy from material that has already been processed by thousands of meters worth of organisms above them. The amphipods of the Mariana Trench solve this problem through a combination of behavioral and physiological adaptations. They are scavengers, feeding on whatever organic material they can find, including the carcasses of fish, squid, and other organisms that sink to the bottom. When food arrives, they converge on it in large numbers, feeding aggressively and rapidly, consuming the material as quickly as possible before it is buried by sediment or dispersed by currents. When food is absent, they slow their metabolisms to minimal levels, waiting in a state of near dormancy until the next food source arrives. This feast or famine strategy is common among deep-sea organisms, but in the Hadal zone it is taken to an extreme. The intervals between meals can be weeks or months. The metabolic cost of waiting must be minimized. The efficiency of feeding, when food is available, must be maximized. Every calorie counts, and wasting energy is a death sentence. The bacteria of the Mariana Trench faced the same energy problem, but solve it differently. Many Hadal bacteria are chemoautotrophs, organisms that derive their energy not from organic food, but from inorganic chemical reactions. They oxidize hydrogen, methane, sulfur compounds, and other chemicals that seep from the rocks beneath the trench floor, using the energy released by these reactions to fix carbon dioxide into organic molecules. This process, called chemosynthesis, is the deep ocean equivalent of photosynthesis, but powered by geology rather than sunlight. Chemosynthetic bacteria can sustain themselves independently of the surface food chain, deriving their energy entirely from the chemical activity of the Earth's interior. They are, in a very real sense, organisms that live off the planet itself, fed by the heat and chemistry of tectonic processes rather than by the light of the sun. The existence of chemosynthetic communities at Hadal depths has profound implications for our understanding of where life can exist. If organisms can sustain themselves entirely on geological energy, without any connection to sunlight or surface productivity, then life could potentially exist in any environment where liquid water comes into contact with chemically active rock. This includes not only the deep ocean of Earth, but also the subsurface oceans of icy moons like Europa and Enceladus, where liquid water is believed to exist beneath thick ice shells in contact with rocky seafloors that could support the same kinds of chemical reactions that power chemosynthetic communities on Earth. This is not science fiction. This is a hypothesis grounded in direct observation of real organisms living in real conditions on our own planet. The Mariana Trench is not just an alien environment on Earth. It is a model for alien environments elsewhere in the solar system. The sensory world of Hadal organisms is another dimension of their alien biology. At the surface, most organisms rely heavily on vision. Light provides information about the location of food, predators, mates, and obstacles. In the Hadal zone, light does not exist. The organisms there must navigate, find food, avoid predators, and locate mates using senses other than vision. Amphipods at Hadal depths rely primarily on chemoreception, the ability to detect chemical signals dissolved in the water. They can detect the scent of food from hundreds of meters away, navigating toward it through the darkness by following concentration gradients in the water. Their antennae are covered in chemoreceptor cells that are exquisitely sensitive to the organic molecules released by decomposing food. In a world without light, smell is king. The amphipods live in a landscape of chemical signals, a world of gradients and concentrations that is as rich and as informative to them as the visual world is to us, but completely invisible to any camera or human observer. Some Hadal organisms may also use pressure itself as a sensory cue. The pressure at a given depth is extremely stable, varying only slightly with tides, currents, and seismic activity. An organism that could detect these slight pressure variations could, in principle, use them to navigate, to detect the approach of other organisms, or to sense changes in the environment that might indicate food, danger, or opportunity. Whether Hadal organisms actually do this is not yet confirmed, but the possibility illustrates the extent to which life in the trench operates on principles that are fundamentally different from life at the surface. This material has been compressed by the weight of the water above it into a dense, fine-grained medium that behaves in some ways like a fluid and in others like a solid. Organisms burrowing through it encounter resistance that varies with the depth of the burrow, increasing as they penetrate deeper into the sediment column. The chemistry of the sediment changes with depth, as oxygen is consumed by microbial activity in the upper layers and is replaced by reduced compounds in the layers below. The boundary between the oxygenated surface layer and the anoxic subsurface is called the redox boundary, and it is a zone of intense microbial activity where organisms that thrive at the interface between oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor environments perform chemical reactions that drive the cycling of carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and other elements through the Hadal ecosystem. The Mariana Trench is not simply deep, dark, and cold. It is a complex, structured, chemically dynamic environment with multiple habitat types, multiple energy sources, and multiple interacting communities of organisms. Each new investigation reveals another layer of complexity. Each new expedition returns with data that forces a revision of existing models. The trench does not simplify as we learn more about it. It complexifies. It reveals new dimensions of alienness with every question we ask. And the questions, far from being exhausted, are multiplying faster than the answers. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how well we understand this environment. Every prediction we have made about the Mariana Trench has been, at best, partially correct. The depth limits of fish life were wrong. The estimates of microbial biomass were wrong. The models of food web dynamics were incomplete. The assumptions about chemical contamination were naive. The trench has consistently defied our expectations, and the consistency of these defiances suggests that the problem is not with any individual prediction, but with the framework from which the predictions emerge. We have been applying surface biology to a Hadal environment, and surface biology does not apply. The Mariana Trench is operating on its own terms, following its own rules, and those rules are alien enough to confound our best models. The exploration of the Mariana Trench has also intersected with an unlikely field, the study of missing submarines and lost vessels. Throughout maritime history, ships have vanished in the Pacific without a trace. Some of these disappearances occurred in waters deep enough that the wreckage could rest at Hadal or near Hadal depths, beyond the reach of any salvage operation, and in conditions where the pressure would compress and distort the remains beyond recognition. The trench and its surrounding deep waters act as a repository for objects that sink below the limits of human recovery, a geological vault that seals its contents under thousands of atmospheres of force and kilometers of darkness. The USS Thresher, lost in 1963 at a depth of approximately 2,500 meters in the Atlantic, demonstrated what deep ocean pressure does to a submarine. The vessel was reduced to small fragments scattered across the seafloor. At Hadal depths, where the pressure is several times greater than the depth at which the Thresher was lost, the compression and fragmentation would be correspondingly more severe. The Mariana Trench has likely received objects, both natural and human-made, that have been compressed beyond identification, absorbed into the sediment, and erased from the record by the same forces that make the trench such a hostile environment for exploration. This dimension of the trench is rarely discussed in scientific contexts, but it adds to the environment's alien character. The Mariana Trench is not merely an ecosystem, it is a geological process, a place where matter is consumed, compressed, and eventually recycled. The subducting plate that forms the trench carries everything on its surface: sediment, rock, organic debris, and human-made objects, downward into the Earth's mantle, where it will be melted and reformed over timescales that dwarf human civilization. The trench is a mouth, swallowing the surface of the planet and feeding it to the interior. It is creation and destruction operating simultaneously, on a scale that makes human activity seem momentary and small. The Mariana Trench is Earth's most alien environment, because it is a place where the familiar rules do not apply. The physics are different. The chemistry is different. The biology is different. The organisms are different. Even time operates differently, with metabolisms running at rates that make surface biology seem frantic by comparison. It is an environment that humbles our technology, confounds our predictions, and expands our understanding of what life can be. It is here, on our own planet, beneath our own oceans, waiting in the dark. The deeper truth about the Mariana Trench is not about depth or pressure or darkness, though all of these are essential to understanding it. The deeper truth is about what that the trench reveals, about the nature of life itself, about the boundaries of biology, and about the scale of human ignorance regarding the planet we inhabit. The trench is a mirror, and what it reflects back at us is an image of a world that is far more complex, far more resilient, and far more mysterious than the one we thought we knew. Let that sink in. We have explored less than 5% of the Earth's ocean floor, The Mariana Trench, the deepest and most famous of the Hadal trenches, has been surveyed across less than 1/100% of its total area. The organisms that have been collected from its depths, the snailfish, the amphipods, the bacteria, the xenophyrophores, the unnamed and unclassified creatures that appear in footage but have never been captured, these represent a sample so small that it is, in any rigorous statistical sense, meaningless. We are drawing conclusions about an ecosystem the size of a small country based on specimens collected from a handful of points scattered across its expanse. Every statement we make about the Mariana Trench carries an implicit caveat that we rarely acknowledge, based on what we have seen, based on the tiny fraction we have examined, based on assumptions that the trench has, again and again, proven wrong. The deeper truth begins with the recognition that the Mariana Trench is not an anomaly. It is not a freak of geology, an isolated pocket of extreme conditions that happens to harbour a few unusual organisms. It is one of roughly 33 Hadal trenches worldwide, each one deeper than 6,000 metres, each one containing its own unique set of conditions, its own community of adapted organisms, and its own collection of unanswered questions. The Tonga Trench, the Philippine Trench, the Kermadec Trench, the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench, the Japan Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench. Each of these is a separate alien world, separated from the others by barriers of inadequate depth that prevent the exchange of organisms and that have allowed each trench to evolve its own distinct fauna. The Mariana Trench is the deepest, but it may not be the most biologically diverse, the most chemically active, or the most scientifically important. We do not know which trench holds the most secrets, because we have not looked at most of them with anything approaching thoroughness. Let that sink in. The Hadal Zone as a whole, encompassing all 33 trenches and their combined area of roughly 1 million square kilometres, has received a total of perhaps a few hundred hours of direct observation over the past 6 decades. A few hundred hours. That is less time than most people spend watching television in a single year. And those few hundred hours of observation have been scattered across a handful of trenches, concentrated at a small number of locations within each trench, and conducted with instruments that can observe only the immediate vicinity of their deployment. The ratio of observed to unobserved Hadal terrain is so extreme that it defies easy analogy. It is as if we had examined a few grains of sand from a beach and declared that we understood the beach. The grains might be representative. They might not. We have no way of knowing without examining more of the beach. And we have not. The biological diversity of the Hadal Zone is almost certainly far greater than what we have documented. Every new expedition to a Hadal Trench has discovered previously unknown species. Every new deployment of a camera or a lander at Hadal depth has returned footage of organisms that were not expected and could not have been predicted. The rate of discovery shows no sign of slowing. This pattern is a statistical signal. It tells us that the total biodiversity of the Hadal Zone is a large multiple of the number of species currently described, and that we are still in the steep early part of the discovery curve, far from the plateau that would indicate we have found most of what there is to find. This is not science fiction. This is the conclusion of scientists who have spent decades studying the Hadal Zone and who understand the limitations of their data better than anyone. The trench is more diverse than we know. The organisms are more adapted than we expected. The ecology is more complex than we modelled, and the pace of new discovery is faster than we predicted. The Mariana Trench is not yielding to our investigation. It is, with each new finding, revealing how much more investigation is needed. The implications of this extend far beyond marine biology. The organisms of the Hadal Zone have developed biochemical solutions to problems that our technology has not yet solved. The pressure-stabilizing properties of TMAO, the membrane modification strategies of Hadal amphipods, the extreme enzyme kinetics of Hadal microorganisms, each of these represents a natural technology that could have applications in medicine, industry, and materials science. The enzymes of Hadal bacteria, adapted to function at near-freezing temperatures and extreme pressures, could be useful in cold chain processes, high-pressure food processing, and the synthesis of materials that require extreme conditions. The proteins of Hadal organisms stabilized against denaturation by molecular mechanisms we have only recently begun to understand, could serve as models for the design of artificial proteins with enhanced stability for pharmaceutical and industrial use. The Mariana Trench is not merely a scientific curiosity, it is a library of solutions, written in the language of molecular biology, to engineering problems that we have been trying to solve using conventional technology. And we have read only the first few pages of this library. The connection to astrobiology makes the trench's significance even broader. If life can exist at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, sustained by geological chemistry in the absence of sunlight, then the range of environments in which life could exist in the universe is vastly larger than we once assumed. Every icy moon with a subsurface ocean, every rocky planet with deep water, every environment where liquid water meets chemically active rock becomes a candidate for harboring life. The Mariana Trench does not prove that life exists beyond Earth, but it proves that life can exist in conditions that we once considered incompatible with it, and it demonstrates that the adaptations required to survive in those conditions are, while extreme, entirely achievable by the processes of biology. The trench also forces us to reconsider our assumptions about the fragility of life. At the surface, life seems delicate. It requires specific temperatures, specific pH levels, specific concentrations of oxygen and nutrients. It wilts under heat, freezes in cold, suffocates without air, and starves without food. But the organisms of the Mariana Trench survive in conditions that would destroy any surface organism instantly. They are not fragile. They are extraordinarily robust, adapted to withstand forces that our strongest machines can barely endure. Life, the Mariana Trench teaches us, is not a delicate experiment that requires careful conditions. It is a relentless force that adapts, persists, and thrives in environments that seem designed to prevent it. The question is not whether life can survive in extreme conditions. The question is whether there are any conditions extreme enough to prevent life from adapting to them. The Mariana Trench suggests that the answer may be no. The deeper truth is also about responsibility. We have contaminated the Mariana Trench before we have understood it. Plastic and industrial chemicals have reached the bottom. The organisms that live there carry pollutants in their tissues. We have altered the chemistry of the most alien environment on our planet before we have catalogued its inhabitants, characterized its ecosystems, or understood its role in the global ocean system. The ethical implications of this are significant. If the Mariana Trench harbors organisms that are found nowhere else on Earth, organisms with unique biochemistry, unique adaptations, and unique potential for scientific and medical applications, then contaminating their environment before we have even identified them is a loss that cannot be quantified. We may be destroying potential cures, potential technologies, and potential knowledge before we know they exist. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how well we understand our own planet. The Mariana Trench proves this. The darkness proves it. The pressure proves it. The life that thrives in both proves it most of all. The deepest truth about Earth's most alien environment is that it is here, beneath us, right now, and we have barely begun to comprehend it. The relationship between the Mariana Trench and the global carbon cycle deserves particular attention in this context because it connects the alien biology of the trench to processes that affect every organism on the planet, including us. The deep ocean is the largest active carbon reservoir on Earth, containing roughly 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere. Organic carbon that sinks to the deep ocean floor, including the Hadal Zone, is effectively sequestered from the atmospheric system for periods ranging from centuries to millennia. The rate at which this carbon is sequestered and the conditions under which it might be released are critical variables in our understanding of climate change and its future trajectory. The Mariana Trench, with its unusual geometry and its enhanced trapping of organic material, may play a disproportionate role in carbon sequestration relative to its small area. The elevated organic carbon concentrations found in Mariana Trench sediments suggest that the trench acts as a sink, capturing and burying carbon at rates that exceed those on the surrounding abyssal plains. The microbial communities that process this carbon, breaking it down and incorporating it into their own biomass, or releasing it as dissolved carbon dioxide, determine how much of the sequestered carbon remains in the sediment and how much is returned to the water column. Understanding these microbial processes is essential to predicting how the deep ocean carbon cycle will respond to changes in surface productivity, ocean circulation, and atmospheric composition in the coming decades and centuries. But we do not understand these processes adequately. The data from the Mariana Trench are too sparse, too geographically limited, and too temporally brief to support confident predictions about carbon cycling in the Hadal Zone. We know that microbial activity is higher than expected at the deepest levels. We know that the trench geometry concentrates organic material. We know that the pressure and temperature at Hadal depths affect the rates of chemical reactions in ways that differ from surface conditions. But we do not know how these factors interact to determine the net carbon balance of the trench, or how that balance might change in response to perturbations such as altered surface productivity, changed ocean circulation, or increased delivery of anthropogenic pollutants. The Mariana Trench also forces a reconsideration of the concept of habitability itself. In astrobiology, the habitable zone is traditionally defined as the region around a star where liquid water can exist on a planet's surface. This definition is useful for identifying planets where surface life similar to our own might exist, but it is incomplete. The Mariana Trench demonstrates that life can exist far from any star's habitable zone, sustained by geological energy rather than stellar energy, in conditions of darkness, cold, and pressure that have no parallel on the surface. If the habitable zone is defined not by stellar radiation, but by the availability of liquid water and chemical energy, then the number of potentially habitable worlds in the universe expands enormously. Every icy moon, every ocean world, every body with subsurface water in contact with active geology becomes a candidate. The organisms of the Mariana Trench provide the empirical basis for this expanded definition. They are the proof of concept. They demonstrate that life does not require a star's warmth, a planet's atmosphere, or a surface bathed in light. It requires only the right chemistry, the right conditions for biochemical reactions to proceed, and enough time for those reactions to produce self-replicating systems capable of adaptation. The Mariana Trench has all of these things. Europa may have them too. Enceladus may have them. And there may be billions of similar environments scattered across the galaxies, each one a potential nursery for life that we have not yet learned to recognize. The deeper truth, the one that underlies all of the individual facts and discoveries and implications discussed in this account, is a truth about perspective. We see the world from the surface. We build our understanding of biology from surface observations. We define the requirements of life based on surface conditions, and then we encounter the Mariana Trench, and we discover that our perspective has been too narrow, our definitions too restrictive, and our understanding of life too limited. The trench does not merely add a footnote to the textbook of biology. It rewrites several chapters. It demonstrates that the biology we know, the biology of sunlight and warmth and moderate pressure, is not the only biology. It is one biology among many, one solution among many, to the problem of how to be alive. The Mariana Trench hosts another solution, and there may be others we have not yet discovered, in environments we have not yet explored, on worlds we have not yet reached. The 95% of the ocean floor that remains unexplored is not a trivial gap in our knowledge. It is a vast, dark, pressurized frontier that may contain more biological diversity, more biochemical novelty, and more fundamental scientific insights than all the explored environments on the planet's surface combined. The Mariana Trench is the deepest corner of this frontier, and it has already yielded discoveries that have changed our understanding of life. What the rest of the frontier holds, in the other 32 Hadal trenches, in the vast abyssal plains, in the mid-ocean ridges and submarine volcanic chains that we have barely surveyed, is a question that we cannot answer and that we have, so far, barely begun to ask. The Mariana Trench has taught us something that no surface environment could. It has taught us that the world we live on is capable of producing life in conditions that seem incompatible with life, that biology is more creative and more tenacious than our models predict, and that the most profound mysteries of our planet lie not in its skies or on its continents, but in its deepest waters, in the crushing darkness under the weight of the sea. What does it mean to live on a planet that contains an alien world within itself? What does it mean to know that the conditions at the bottom of your own ocean are more similar to the conditions expected on the moons of Jupiter than to the conditions in your own backyard? These are questions that the Mariana Trench forces upon anyone who engages with it deeply enough, and they carry implications that touch on science, philosophy, and the most basic human relationship to the world around us. The first implication is a recalibration of scale. We tend to think of the Earth as a known place, mapped, photographed, surveyed from orbit, named and labelled in atlases and databases. The Mariana Trench reveals that this sense of familiarity is an illusion. The mapped, photographed, surveyed Earth is the surface Earth, the thin layer of land and shallow water that we occupy and observe. Beneath this layer lies a world that is as poorly known as any frontier in human history. The Hadal Zone, covering an estimated 1 million square kilometers of trench floor, has been visited by fewer people than the surface of the Moon and has been observed by instruments for fewer total hours than a single television series runs in a single season. The Earth is not as well known as we think it is. The parts of it that we know well are the parts that are accessible, visible, and hospitable. The parts that we do not know well, the deep, the dark, the pressurized, are the parts that make up most of the planet. We live on the roof and assume we know the building. The second implication concerns the nature of life itself. The Mariana Trench demonstrates that life is not constrained to the narrow set of conditions that characterize the surface environment. It can exist in the dark, it can exist in the cold, it can exist under pressures that would destroy any machine we have built for sustained operations. It can derive energy from geological chemistry rather than sunlight. It can modify its own molecular machinery to function under conditions that our textbooks say should prevent function. The range of conditions under which life is possible is far broader than the range of conditions under which familiar life exists. This has consequences that extend beyond Earth. Every planet, every moon, every icy body in the solar system that possesses liquid water in contact with chemically active rock becomes a place where life is conceivable, not merely in theory, but based on observed precedent from the deepest parts of our own ocean. There is a philosophical pause worth taking here. The Mariana Trench is a reminder that the world does not exist for us. The organisms at the bottom of the trench do not know we exist. They have no concept of the surface. They have no awareness of sunlight, air, weather, or any of the things that define our world. They inhabit their own world, complete in itself, self-sustaining, self-contained, operating on principles that are alien to ours. They are not lesser creatures occupying a lesser environment. They are different creatures occupying a different environment, one that they are perfectly adapted to and that they have inhabited successfully for an immense span of time. The Mariana Trench is not a marginal place. It is a central place, central to the geological processes that shape the Earth's surface, central to the chemical cycles that regulate the ocean's composition, and central to the question of what life can become when it is given enough time and enough pressure. The third implication is ethical and urgent. We are polluting the Mariana Trench. We are doing so inadvertently through the accumulation of industrial chemicals and plastic waste that sink through the water column and reach the bottom over periods of years or decades. But inadvertent harm is still harm. The organisms at the bottom of the trench carry measurable concentrations of PCBs and microplastics in their tissues. We do not know what effect these contaminants are having on their health, their reproduction, their population dynamics, or their long-term survival. We do not know because we do not have baseline data from before the contamination began. We arrived too late to see the trench in its pristine state. We can only study it in its already altered state and try to infer what has changed. This situation calls for a response that matches the scale of the problem. The Mariana Trench and other Hadal environments need protection, not because they are fragile in the conventional sense, but because they are unique, irreplaceable, and poorly understood. The organisms that live there are found nowhere else. The adaptations they have developed exist nowhere else. The biochemical knowledge encoded in their genomes exists nowhere else. If these organisms are harmed or eliminated by contamination, the loss is permanent. There is no backup. There is no second chance. The Mariana Trench is not renewable. It is singular. And there is something deeper still, something that the trench teaches about the relationship between knowledge and wonder. In most fields of human inquiry, knowledge diminishes wonder. The more we learn about a subject, the less mysterious it becomes. The Mariana Trench inverts this relationship. The more we learn about it, the more wonderful it becomes, because each new discovery reveals another dimension of complexity, another layer of adaptation, another way in which life has exceeded our expectation. The trench does not become less mysterious as we study it. It becomes more mysterious because each answer opens a door to a larger room of questions. The wonder is not diminished by knowledge, it is amplified by it. The Mariana Trench is one of those rare subjects that grows in stature the more closely you examine it, revealing new depths, in every sense of the word, with every investigation. The organisms of the Mariana Trench are alive right now, at this moment. In the darkness, in the cold, under the crushing weight of nearly 11 kilometers of seawater, they are feeding, moving, reproducing, and adapting to conditions that we can barely imagine. They have been doing so for longer than we can measure with certainty. They will continue doing so regardless of whether we study them, protect them, or ignore them entirely. The trench does not need us, but we may need the trench for the knowledge it holds, for the perspective it provides, and for the humility it enforces on a species that sometimes forgets how small it is. There is a fourth implication that emerges from the study of the Mariana Trench, and it concerns the future of deep ocean research itself. The gap between what we know and what we need to know about the Hadal Zone is not closing, it is by several measures widening. The rate at which new questions emerge from Hadal research exceeds the rate at which existing questions are answered. The number of Hadal trenches that have been visited by any scientific expedition remains in the single digits. The total investment in Hadal research, globally, is a fraction of the investment in space exploration, atmospheric science, or terrestrial ecology, and the technological challenges of working at Hadal depths remain formidable, with each new generation of instruments only marginally more capable than the last. If the Mariana Trench is indeed Earth's most alien environment, and if the organisms it harbours hold biochemical and scientific secrets of genuine significance, then the current level of investment in understanding it is inadequate, not because the researchers lack talent or dedication. They have both in abundance, but because the scale of the unknown is so vast, and the logistical and financial barriers to exploration are so high, that individual efforts cannot make more than incremental progress. Understanding the Hadal Zone at a level comparable to our understanding of terrestrial ecosystems would require a sustained, multi-decade international program of research with dedicated ships, dedicated instruments, and dedicated funding. No such program currently exists. The contrast with space exploration is instructive. Humanity has committed billions of dollars and decades of effort to exploring environments that are, in many respects, simpler than the Mariana Trench. The surface of Mars, while scientifically fascinating, is a geological environment with no confirmed life, no liquid water, and no active biology to study. The Mariana Trench is a biological environment teeming with life, actively evolving, and connected to the global systems that regulate our climate, our ocean chemistry, and our food supply. The scientific return per dollar invested in Hadal research is, by any reasonable measure, at least comparable to the return from space exploration. Yet the funding disparity is enormous. The priorities are misaligned, not because space is unimportant, but because the deep ocean has been neglected. Perhaps the most important implication of the Mariana Trench is the simplest. We do not know our own planet. We live on it, we walk its surface, we breathe its air, we swim in its shallow waters, and we assume that this familiarity constitutes knowledge. It does not. The Mariana Trench proves that the planet we inhabit contains environments so extreme and so different from the surface that they constitute separate worlds. We have mapped those surface worlds with admirable thoroughness. We have left the deep worlds almost entirely unexplored. The imbalance is not merely a gap in our scientific understanding. It is a blind spot in our relationship with the planet itself, a failure to appreciate the full extent and the full complexity of the world we call home. The Mariana Trench will not wait for us to correct this imbalance. It will continue to exist, to evolve, and to harbour its alien life whether we study it or not. But the opportunity it presents to understand life in its most extreme form, to discover organisms and adaptations that could transform medicine and technology, and to prepare for the search for life beyond Earth, is an opportunity that diminishes with every year we do not fully pursue it. The trench has waited for us since before we existed. The question is whether we will arrive in time to learn what it has to teach, or whether we will study it only in retrospect, after the contamination, the disruption, and the loss of species that we never knew existed have made the lessons incomplete. The Mariana Trench has been there for longer than anyone can say with precision, carved by forces that operate on timescales that human history cannot contain. It was there before the first ship crossed the Pacific. It was there before the first human looked at the ocean and wondered what lay beneath. It will be there when the last ship has sailed and the last question has been asked, pressing down with its 1,000 atmospheres, holding its darkness, nurturing its alien life in the silence and the cold. We call it Earth's most alien environment, and the word is not chosen for dramatic effect. It is chosen because it is accurate. The conditions at the bottom of the Mariana Trench are more similar to the conditions expected in the subsurface oceans of icy moons than to the conditions in any habitat on the Earth's surface. The organisms that inhabit it have been rebuilt at the molecular level to withstand forces that would destroy any surface creature. Their proteins are different. Their membranes are different. Their energy sources are different. Their senses detect a world that our instruments can barely measure. They are terrestrial organisms in the taxonomy sense, sharing a common ancestry with every other living thing on the planet. But they are alien organisms in the functional sense, operating on principles that are as foreign to surface biology as surface biology would be to them. The trench is a reminder. It is a reminder that the Earth is not fully known, that its deepest places remain mysterious, that the life it harbours extends far beyond the familiar forms that populate our textbooks and our nature documentaries. It is a reminder that pressure, darkness, and cold are not merely obstacles to be overcome, but environments to be inhabited, and that the organisms that inhabit them have achieved feats of biochemical engineering that our laboratories have not matched. It is a reminder that the word alien does not require another planet. It requires only a sufficient distance from the familiar, and the Mariana Trench provides that distance in abundance. The pressure will continue. It does not pause. It does not relent. It does not fluctuate with the weather or the seasons or the moods of the civilization that floats above it on the surface. 1,100 atmospheres, pressing inward from every direction, compressing the water, the sediment, and the organisms into states that the surface world cannot replicate. The darkness will continue. No sunlight will reach the bottom of the trench tomorrow, or next year, or in 1,000 years. The cold will continue, stable and perpetual, holding the water at temperatures that never change, and the life will continue. The amphipods will scavenge, the snailfish will hunt, the bacteria will metabolize, the xenophyrophores will grow, adding another layer to their tests, another grain of sediment to their structures. The unnamed organisms, the ones that appear at the edges of camera footage and disappear before identification is possible, will go about their lives in the darkness, unseen and uncategorized, following rhythms and patterns that we have not yet deciphered. There is something both humbling and reassuring about this continuity. Humbling because it demonstrates that the most complex and most adapted ecosystems on Earth can function entirely without human knowledge, intervention, or approval. Reassuring because it demonstrates that life is not dependent on the narrow range of conditions that we occupy. It is broader than our experience. It is more creative than our imagination. It persists in places we cannot go, under conditions we cannot endure, using strategies we have not invented. The Mariana Trench is not waiting for us. It is not expecting our return. It does not mark the anniversaries of Pickard and Walsh's dive, or Cameron's solo descent, or Vescovo's multiple expeditions. It simply persists, doing what it has always done, being what it has always been, the deepest wound on the face of the planet, the darkest corner of the world's largest ocean, the most extreme and most alien environment on the surface of the Earth. And somewhere in that environment, right now, at this exact moment, something is alive, something pale and translucent and impossibly adapted, drifting through water that would crush any machine we have sent to stay. Something with no name in any language, no entry in any database, no photograph in any archive. Something that has never been seen by any eye, human or electronic, and that may never be seen. Something that exists entirely on its own terms, in its own world, under its own rules, at the bottom of an ocean that covers more than half the planet we call home. We tend to think of discovery as something that happens in distant places, on other continents, in the upper atmosphere, or on the surfaces of other worlds. The Mariana Trench corrects this assumption with quiet finality. The greatest discoveries remaining on Earth are not in the Amazon, not in Antarctica, not in the caves of Southeast Asia or the ice sheets of Greenland. They are below us. They are beneath the water that we cross on ships, that we fish with nets, that we pollute with our waste. They are at the bottom of trenches that we have named but not explored, mapped but not surveyed, acknowledged but not understood. The Mariana Trench is the deepest of these trenches, but it is not the only one. 32 others wait in the darkness, each one an alien world, each one potentially harboring secrets as profound as anything the Mariana has revealed. The history of science is full of moments when a new observation overturned an old assumption, when a discovery in an unexpected place forced a revision of what was considered possible. The discovery of life at hydrothermal vents in 1977 was such a moment. The discovery of extremophile microorganisms in volcanic hot springs was another. The ongoing discoveries in the Mariana Trench are part of this tradition, each one demonstrating that life is more versatile, more tenacious, and more creative than our models predicted. Each one pushing the boundary of the possible a little further into territory that was previously thought to be barren. The Mariana Trench is Earth's most alien environment, not because it is hostile, not because it is dangerous, not because it is far away, because it is not far away at all. It is here. It is beneath us. It is a part of the planet we walk on, the planet we think we know, the planet we assume we have explored. It is a part of the world that reminds us, with quiet, relentless, crushing force, that the world is larger than our knowledge of it. That darkness can be full, that pressure can be endured, that life, given enough time and enough reason, will find a way to exist in places that should not support it. And the deepest place on Earth is alive. These sponge grounds, like the coral reefs, are vulnerable to bottom trawling and are growing too slowly to recover from disturbance on human timescales. The seamounts of the Atlantic, underwater mountains that rise from the abyssal plains but do not reach the surface, are biological hotspots that support communities of organisms distinct from those on the surrounding flat seafloor. The Atlantic contains thousands of seamounts, the vast majority of which have never been surveyed biologically. Sonar has mapped the locations and shapes of many of these seamounts, revealing that they are more numerous and more widely distributed than earlier estimates had suggested. Each seamount is a potential biological oasis, supporting communities of corals, sponges, fish, and invertebrates that are adapted to the enhanced currents and food supply that the seamount's topography generates. The relationship between the sonar mapping of the Atlantic and the international regulatory framework for marine conservation is direct and important. The designation of marine protected areas in the deep Atlantic, which is governed by regional fisheries management organizations and by the International Seabed Authority, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, depends on knowledge of the distribution of vulnerable marine ecosystems. This knowledge comes primarily from sonar surveys and submersible observations. The gaps in the survey coverage correspond to gaps in the conservation knowledge, and consequently, to gaps in the protection of vulnerable habitats. The deep-sea mining debate adds another dimension to the significance of sonar mapping in the Atlantic. The polymetallic sulfide deposits associated with hydrothermal vents on the mid-Atlantic ridge and the polymetallic crusts that coat the surfaces of Atlantic seamounts contain concentrations of metals including copper, zinc, gold, and cobalt that have attracted commercial interest. The assessment of the environmental impact of mining these deposits requires detailed knowledge of the geological features, the biological communities, and the connectivity between communities, knowledge that depends on sonar mapping and biological survey data that are not yet available at the required scale. The relationship between what sonar has revealed and what remains hidden beneath the Atlantic is expressed most starkly by the statistics of exploration. More humans have walked on the surface of the moon than have visited the bottom of the Puerto Rico Trench. More humans have climbed Mount Everest in a single year than have ever descended below 5,000 meters in the Atlantic. The total time spent by human observers on the deep Atlantic floor, across all expeditions in all nations over more than a century of deep ocean exploration, amounts to perhaps a few hundred hours to observe a seafloor that covers more than 100 million square kilometers. The remotely operated vehicles and autonomous underwater vehicles that supplement human observation have accumulated more time on the Atlantic floor, perhaps a few thousand hours in total, but their coverage is still vanishingly small relative to the total area. The combined visual coverage of the Atlantic floor by human and robotic observers, expressed as a percentage of the total area, rounds to zero. We have seen an infinitesimal fraction of the Atlantic's floor. Everything we know about its biology, its geology, and its acoustic environment is based on this infinitesimal fraction, extrapolated to the whole through models that are continuously being revised as new data reveal features that the models did not predict. The sonar surveys have covered more area than the visual observations, but the sonar coverage is still incomplete. The 20 to 25% of the Atlantic floor that has been surveyed by multibeam sonar provides detailed bathymetric maps that reveal the shape of the bottom at resolutions of 10 to 50 meters. But bathymetric maps show only the shape of the surface. They do not show the composition of the rock, the biological communities on the surface, the acoustic emissions from geological processes, or the organisms in the water column above. Each of these requires additional instruments and additional surveys, each of which covers less area than the bathymetric mapping. The layered incompleteness of Atlantic exploration means that different types of knowledge decrease at different rates as you move from the well-studied areas near the continental margins to the poorly studied areas in the central basin. Bathymetric knowledge provided by multibeam sonar covers perhaps 20 to 25% of the floor. Geological knowledge provided by sampling and drilling covers perhaps a few percent. Biological knowledge provided by trawls, submersibles, and camera systems covers perhaps a fraction of a percent. Acoustic knowledge provided by SOSUS and supplementary hydrophones covers perhaps 10 to 20% for the low-frequency band, but zero for higher frequencies. Each layer of knowledge is thinner than the one above, and the bottom layer, the comprehensive, multi-parameter characterization that would constitute true understanding of the Atlantic floor, covers virtually nothing. The implications of this layered incompleteness for the interpretation of what sonar has captured are direct. Every interpretation is based on incomplete data. Every model is constrained by the available observations, which are sparse, geographically biased, and temporally limited. Every extrapolation from the surveyed areas to the unsurveyed areas is an assumption, and the history of Atlantic exploration suggests that these assumptions are consistently optimistic, consistently underestimating the complexity of the features that the next survey will reveal. The sonar data that have been collected are not wasted. They are enormously valuable, providing the most detailed views of the Atlantic floor that have ever been obtained. But they are a beginning, not an end. They show what the Atlantic floor looks like at the surveyed locations. They do not show what it looks like everywhere else. And the everywhere else is the vast majority of the floor, the 75 to 80% that remains unmapped, unsurveyed, and unknown, hiding features that sonar would reveal if sonar were deployed, but that remain hidden because the surveys have not been conducted. The accidental nature of many of the Atlantic's most important discoveries is a recurring theme that underscores the incompleteness of the exploration. The Lost City hydrothermal field was found by accident during a geological survey that was not looking for vents. The cold water coral reefs were identified when submersibles visited mounds that had been noticed in sonar data but whose biological nature had not been recognized. The oceanic core complexes were discovered when multi-beam surveys of the mid-Atlantic ridge revealed dome-shaped features that did not fit the standard spreading model. Each of these discoveries was serendipitous, the result of an instrument being in the right place at the right time. The question of how many equivalent discoveries are waiting in the unsurveyed 75% of the Atlantic floor is a question that haunts the researchers and that motivates the continuing effort to expand the surveyed area. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how well we know the Atlantic. The sonar data prove it. The accidental discoveries prove it. The biological survey deficit proves it. The submarine landslide hazard proves it. And the 75% of unmapped seafloor proves it most comprehensively. The Atlantic is not the well-known, thoroughly explored ocean that its position between Europe and the Americas might suggest. It is an ocean whose floor is less well mapped than the surface of Mars, whose biological communities are less well catalogued than the forests of the Amazon, and whose acoustic environment is less well monitored than the upper atmosphere. The climate dimension of what sonar has captured beneath the Atlantic adds urgency that extends beyond scientific curiosity. The Atlantic plays a central role in the global climate system through the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great conveyor belt of ocean currents that carries warm surface water northward from the tropics and returns cold deep water southward toward the Antarctic. This circulation pattern, which is driven by the sinking of cold, dense water in the North Atlantic, transports heat from the tropics to the high latitudes and moderates the climate of Western Europe. Changes in the circulation, which have occurred in the geological past, and which may be occurring now in response to the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, could have profound consequences for climate patterns across the Northern Hemisphere. The acoustic monitoring of the Atlantic provides data relevant to the overturning circulation because the sounds produced by the deep water as it flows along the seafloor can be used to track the speed and direction of the deep currents. The interaction of the deep currents with bathymetric features produces acoustic emissions that vary with the flow speed, and long-term monitoring of these emissions could provide information about changes in the deep circulation that are relevant to climate projections. This application of acoustic monitoring has been discussed in the literature but has not been implemented at the scale needed for continuous surveillance. The connection between the deep Atlantic and the global carbon cycle is another dimension that links the sonar discoveries to planetary-scale processes. The deep Atlantic is a major reservoir of dissolved carbon, and the rate at which carbon is transported from the surface to the deep, through the biological pump and through the overturning circulation, affects the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Understanding these processes requires knowledge of the deep Atlantic's physical, chemical, and biological conditions. Knowledge that sonar mapping and acoustic monitoring can contribute to, but that has not been collected at the comprehensiveness required. The organisms of the deep Atlantic play roles in the carbon cycle that are only beginning to be understood. The biological pump, which transports organic carbon from the surface to the deep through the sinking of dead organisms and fecal material, is mediated by the organisms of the deep scattering layer, a dense concentration of lanternfish, squid, and crustaceans that migrates vertically through the water column every day. The acoustic monitoring of the deep scattering layer, which is detectable by sonar as a false bottom that rises at night and descends at dawn, provides information about the biomass and distribution of the organisms that drive the pump. Changes in the deep scattering layer caused by overfishing, climate change, or pollution could affect the efficiency of the biological pump and, consequently, the rate at which the ocean absorbs atmospheric carbon dioxide. The deep-sea mining debate connects the sonar discoveries to economic and environmental policy in ways that are both complex and contentious. The mineral deposits on the mid-Atlantic ridge and on Atlantic seamounts contain metals that are in growing demand for renewable energy technologies, including cobalt, nickel, copper, and rare earth elements. The assessment of the feasibility and environmental impact of mining these deposits requires detailed sonar mapping of the deposit locations, the surrounding geological features, and the biological communities that the mining would affect. The sonar data needed for this assessment are not available at the required resolution for most of the potential mining locations, and collecting them would require substantial additional survey effort. The precautionary principle applies directly to the deep-sea mining debate. The biological communities at risk from mining, including the hydrothermal vent ecosystems and the seamount communities, are poorly known, slowly reproducing, and potentially vulnerable to disturbance. Mining operations that destroy these communities would cause damage that is irreversible on human timescales, because the communities recover, if at all, over periods of decades to centuries. The sonar data needed to assess the risk are not yet available. The precautionary approach would be to complete the surveys before allowing mining to proceed, ensuring that the environmental impact can be properly assessed and mitigated. The deeper truth is that the sonar technology exists to map the entire Atlantic floor. The multi-beam systems are available. The research vessels are built. The analytical software is developed. The scientific expertise is trained. The only thing missing is the sustained investment needed to deploy the systems at the scale required. The Seabed 2030 initiative has set the goal. The funding to achieve the goal has not been committed, and every year that passes without comprehensive mapping is a year in which geological hazards go uncharacterized, biological communities go undiscovered, acoustic sources go unidentified, and the gap between what we know about the Atlantic and what the Atlantic contains grows wider rather than narrower. The Seabed 2030 initiative provides a framework for addressing the mapping deficit, but the scale of the challenge is enormous. Mapping the entire Atlantic floor at modern resolution would require surveying roughly 80 million square kilometers of currently unmapped seafloor. At a typical survey rate of roughly 200 square kilometers per day per vessel, the task would require roughly 400,000 vessel days, or roughly 1,000 vessel years. At a typical operating cost of $30,000 to $50,000 per day, the total cost would be roughly $12 to $20 billion. This is a large sum, but is comparable to the cost of a single major space mission or a single large particle physics experiment. The comparison with other scientific infrastructure investments is revealing. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN cost roughly $13.5 billion to build and costs roughly $1 billion per year to operate. The James Webb Space Telescope cost roughly $10 billion. The International Space Station has cost roughly $150 billion over its lifetime. Each of these investments has been justified by the scientific return, the fundamental discoveries about the nature of the universe that the instruments have enabled. The mapping of the Atlantic floor would enable discoveries about the nature of the planet that are arguably as fundamental and certainly more directly relevant to human welfare. The political economy of ocean mapping, the dynamics that determine how much funding is allocated and how it is distributed, differs from the political economy of space science or particle physics in ways that disadvantage ocean research. Space missions and large physics experiments are typically funded by single nations or small consortia, with strong institutional champions and well-established funding mechanisms. Ocean mapping is a diffuse, distributed activity conducted by many nations with different priorities, different capabilities, and different levels of commitment. The coordination needed to achieve a global mapping goal is inherently more difficult than the coordination needed for a single large facility. The Seabed 2030 initiative has made significant progress in coordinating international mapping efforts and in raising awareness of the mapping deficit. But the initiative's original timeline, mapping the entire global ocean floor by 2030, is almost certainly unreachable. The pace of mapping would need to accelerate dramatically to achieve the goal, requiring either a massive increase in funding, a massive increase in the number of survey vessels, or the development of new survey technologies that can map the seafloor faster and more cheaply than current multi-beam systems. Autonomous surface vessels equipped with multi-beam sonar represent one potential pathway to faster mapping. These vessels, which can operate without a crew and which can survey continuously for weeks or months, could potentially map the seafloor at a fraction of the cost of crewed research vessels. Several prototype systems are in development or early deployment. Their use for systematic ocean mapping has been proposed and could, if implemented at scale, transform the pace of Atlantic seafloor mapping. The relationship between what sonar has captured beneath the Atlantic and what remains to be captured is ultimately a question about priorities. The technology exists. The scientific justification is overwhelming. The practical applications are clear. The cost is significant, but not prohibitive. The question is whether the nations that border the Atlantic, the wealthiest nations on Earth, will commit the resources needed to map the floor of the ocean that lies between them, the ocean they have been crossing for 5 centuries, the ocean whose surface is familiar and whose depths remain unknown. The Atlantic continues to hide its secrets, not out of malice or concealment, but out of depth. The depth is the barrier, the darkness is the veil, the pressure is the guard, and sonar is the key that opens the door, one survey at a time, one strip of multi-beam data at a time, one discovery at a time, revealing an ocean floor that is more complex, more active, more alive, and more mysterious than anyone had imagined before the sound was sent down and the echo came back. The upsweep's Pacific counterpart may have Atlantic equivalents. The hydrothermal vents that sustain life without sunlight may exist at hundreds of undiscovered locations. The submarine landslide scars that record past catastrophic events may presage future ones. The cold water corals that provide habitat for hundreds of species may be destroyed by trawling before sonar can map their distribution. The acoustic anomalies that resist identification may be produced by sources that would be recognizable if closest range recordings were available. Each of these possibilities is disturbing. Together, they paint a portrait of an ocean that has been hiding its most significant features in plain sight, beneath a surface that humanity has been crossing for half a millennium. Section 6. Implications and reflection. What does it mean that the floor of the most crossed ocean on Earth is less well mapped than the surface of another planet? What does it mean for science, for safety, for conservation, and for our understanding of the world we inhabit? The first implication is about the nature of knowledge and the assumptions we make about familiar environments. The Atlantic feels familiar. It is bordered by nations with long maritime traditions. It is crossed by thousands of ships every day. Its weather patterns are monitored by satellites and weather stations. Its surface currents are charted in every atlas. But this familiarity is surface deep, literally. Below the surface, below the first 200 meters where light penetrates, the Atlantic becomes as alien and as unknown as any environment on the planet. The familiarity of the surface masks the ignorance of the depth. The second implication concerns safety. The Atlantic floor contains geological hazards that are not fully characterized. Submarine landslide zones on the continental slopes could generate tsunamis that would affect coastal populations around the basin. Volcanic activity on the mid-Atlantic ridge could damage submarine cables that carry critical telecommunications infrastructure. Earthquake activity in the subduction zones of the Caribbean and the Scotia Arc could produce events with catastrophic consequences for island nations. The sonar data needed to characterize these hazards exist at some locations, but not at others. And the gaps in the data correspond to gaps in the hazard assessment. There is a philosophical pause worth taking here. The Atlantic Ocean lies between the wealthiest nations on Earth. Europe and North America, which border the Atlantic, have the resources, the technology, and the scientific expertise to map the Atlantic floor comprehensively. The cost, while significant, is modest relative to the economies of the bordering nations. The benefit, in terms of improved hazard assessment, resource management, conservation, and scientific understanding, is substantial. And yet the mapping has not been completed. The most accessible, most heavily used, most economically important ocean on the planet remains less well known in terms of its floor topography than a planet that no human has ever visited. the conservation implications are urgent. Cold water corals, deep-sea sponge fields, and hydrothermal vent communities in the Atlantic are threatened by fishing, mining, and pollution. Protecting these communities requires knowing where they are, and knowing where they are requires sonar mapping that has not been completed. The destruction of deep-sea habitats in the Atlantic is proceeding faster than the surveys that would identify the habitats to be protected. Trawling damage has been documented at cold water coral sites across the Atlantic, and the extent of the damage to undiscovered sites is unknown. The creatures of the deep Atlantic deserve a moment of reflection. The Atlantic harbours populations of blue whales, fin whales, sperm whales, and beaked whales that migrate through its basins, communicating through the SOFAR channel, navigating by sound in the darkness. The Atlantic's hydrothermal vent communities support organisms that derive their energy from the chemistry of the Earth's interior, organisms that represent potential analogues for life on other worlds. The Atlantic's abyssal plains support sparse but widespread communities of organisms adapted to the most food-limited environments on the planet. Each of these communities produces and responds to sound, and each shares the acoustic environment with the anomalous signals that sonar has captured. The rising ambient noise level of the Atlantic, driven by commercial shipping, military sonar, and offshore industrial activity, is degrading this acoustic environment. The Atlantic is the noisiest ocean on the planet because it has the highest density of shipping traffic. The low-frequency noise from thousands of vessels produces a continuous background that masks the calls of whales, reduces the range of acoustic communication, and diminishes the signal-to-noise ratio for detecting natural acoustic events. The sonar recordings from the Atlantic are made against this noisy background, and the detection of subtle anomalies is correspondingly more difficult than in the quieter Pacific. The creatures of the deep Atlantic provide a biological perspective that complements the geological and acoustic dimensions. The Atlantic harbours populations of the world's largest and most acoustically sophisticated marine mammals. Blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales, and sperm whales migrate through the Atlantic basins, using the SOFAR channel for long-range communication. Their calls, recorded by SOSUS hydrophones, provide data on population size, distribution, and behaviour that complement visual surveys. The acoustic record of Atlantic whale populations spans more than 3 decades, providing a time series that is valuable for assessing population trends and for evaluating the effectiveness of conservation measures. The beaked whales of the Atlantic are among the most enigmatic of all marine mammals. These deep-diving species, some of which descend to depths exceeding 3,000 meters, are rarely seen at the surface and are known primarily from strandings and from acoustic detections. The acoustic signatures of several beaked whale species have been characterized from recordings made by SOSUS hydrophones and by dedicated acoustic monitoring systems, and these signatures have been used to map the distribution of beaked whale populations in the deep Atlantic. The mapping has revealed that beaked whales are more widespread and more numerous than visual surveys had suggested, occupying deep water habitats across the basin. The deep-sea fish communities of the Atlantic have been sampled by trawls, submersibles, and camera systems at scattered locations, revealing a diversity that exceeds early estimates. The orange roughy, a deep-water fish that was the target of intensive commercial fishing in the late 20th century, was found to be far more slowly growing and far more vulnerable to overfishing than initial assessments had suggested. Some orange roughy populations in the Atlantic have collapsed under fishing pressure and have shown no sign of recovery, because the species' slow growth rate and late maturation mean that recovery, if it occurs, will take decades. The sonar surveys that identified the seamounts where orange roughy aggregate for spawning were the same surveys that revealed the seamounts' geological complexity and their role as biological hotspots. The relationship between sonar mapping and the protection of deep-sea ecosystems is therefore direct and practical. The sonar data reveal the locations of vulnerable habitats. The biological surveys reveal the communities that inhabit them. The regulatory frameworks provide the mechanisms for protection. The gaps in the sonar coverage correspond to gaps in the knowledge of vulnerable habitats, and consequently, to gaps in their protection. Closing the sonar coverage gaps is not merely a scientific priority, it is a conservation priority, because the habitats that are most at risk are often those that are least well known. The responsibility for closing these gaps is shared among the nations that border the Atlantic, the international organizations that manage deep-sea resources, and the scientific community that conducts the surveys. The technology exists, the ships exist, the expertise exists. The cost, while significant, is modest relative to the economic value of the Atlantic's resources and relative to the cost of other global monitoring programs. The Seabed 2030 initiative provides a framework for international coordination. What remains is the sustained institutional and financial commitment needed to complete the work. The search for extraterrestrial life connects the Atlantic's discoveries to the broadest questions in science. The Lost City hydrothermal field, powered by serpentinization rather than by volcanic heat, provides the primary model for potential life in the subsurface oceans of icy moons. The organisms at Lost City demonstrate that life can be sustained by the chemical energy of rock-water reactions alone, without sunlight, without volcanic heat, and without organic input from the surface. This demonstration has transformed the search for extraterrestrial life by expanding the range of environments that are considered potentially habitable. Ejection 7. The closing the floor of the Atlantic Ocean is not what we assumed it was. It is not flat, it is not featureless, it is not empty, it is not quiet. It is a landscape of extraordinary complexity, sculpted by geological forces that are as active today as they have ever been, populated by organisms that challenge the assumptions of surface-based biology, and producing acoustic signals that propagate through the deep water with power and persistence that our science can detect but cannot always explain. Sonar has revealed this landscape one survey at a time, one strip of multi-beam data at a time, one acoustic recording at a time. Each revelation has been a correction of the previous assumption. The flat, featureless abyss of the early oceanographers has given way to a landscape of volcanic mountains, rift valleys, seamounts, canyons, coral reefs, hydrothermal vents, and sediment features that rival the complexity of any terrestrial landscape. The silent deep of popular imagination has given way to an acoustic environment of extraordinary richness, filled with the calls of whales, the rumbles of earthquakes, the crackling of volcanic eruptions, and the persistent, unexplained signals that resist classification. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, 16,000 kilometers of volcanic mountain chain, was hidden beneath the Atlantic for all of human history until sonar revealed it in the 20th century. The Lost City hydrothermal field, with its 60-meter towers of carbonate minerals and its ecosystems sustained by the chemistry of rock and water, was hidden until an accidental sonar contact in 2000 led to its discovery. The cold water coral reefs that line the continental margins, supporting hundreds of species in the darkness, were hidden until sonar and submersible surveys revealed their extent. Each discovery was a surprise. Each surprise was a correction. And each correction demonstrated that the Atlantic floor was more complex, more active, and more biologically rich than the previous understanding had suggested. The acoustic environment of the deep Atlantic mirrors the geological complexity of the floor. The sounds that propagate through the SOFAR channel include the calls of the world's largest animals, the rumbles of tectonic forces that are reshaping the planet, the crackle of volcanic eruptions that create new seafloor, and the persistent unexplained events that haunt the analysts who study them. The acoustic environment is as rich and as poorly understood as the geological landscape beneath it. The sounds are evidence of processes and sources that our science has partially catalogued and partially explained. The unexplained fraction, small but persistent, is evidence that the catalogue is incomplete. The disturbing quality of what sonar has captured beneath the Atlantic is not about danger or threat. It is about scale. The scale of the features that were unknown until sonar revealed them. The scale of the biological communities that were unsuspected until submersibles visited the vents and the corals. The scale of the acoustic environment that was unheard until hydrophones were deployed in the deep channels, and the scale of what remains unknown, the 75% of the Atlantic floor that has never been surveyed by multi-beam sonar, the countless geological features and biological communities and acoustic sources that exist in this unmapped expanse, hidden not by concealment but by depth. The Atlantic has been crossed by ships for 500 years. Its surface is charted in detail, its weather is monitored continuously, its currents are modelled by supercomputers, and its floor, the solid surface beneath the water, is less well known than the surface of a planet that no human has ever touched. The disparity between the knowledge of the surface and the ignorance of the depth is the most disturbing thing that sonar has captured. Not any single feature, not any single sound, but the vast, persistent, apparently permanent gap between what we think we know about the Atlantic and what sonar reveals every time it is deployed. The Atlantic is still speaking, its ridge is still spreading, its volcanoes are still erupting, its vents are still pumping chemicals into the dark water, its organisms are still feeding, reproducing, and evolving in conditions that no surface creature could survive, and its acoustic environment is still producing signals that our instruments can detect but that our science cannot always explain. Sonar has shown us the edge of this world. It has revealed the contours of its mountains, the shapes of its valleys, the locations of its communities, and the patterns of its sounds. But the edge is not the whole. The whole remains hidden, beneath the surface, beneath the pressure, beneath the darkness, in the 75% of the Atlantic floor that sonar has not yet reached. What sonar has captured beneath the Atlantic is disturbing because it suggests what sonar has not yet captured. The known is vast and surprising. The unknown is vaster, and the gap between the two, between the mapped quarter and the unmapped three-quarters, between the heard fraction and the unheard remainder, is the space where the Atlantic keeps its deepest secrets. The sonar will continue to map, one strip at a time, one expedition at a time, one discovery at a time. The ocean will continue to reveal, one surprise at a time, one correction at a time, one mystery at a time, and the gap will narrow, slowly, over decades and centuries, as the instruments improve, and the surveys accumulate, and the catalogues expand. But the gap will not close entirely. The Atlantic is too large, too deep, and too complex for any monitoring system to catalogue completely. There will always be unmapped areas, unsurveyed features, unidentified sounds, undiscovered organisms. The Atlantic will always contain more than we know about it. And the disturbing quality of what sonar has captured, the persistent, irreducible surprise of each new discovery, will continue for as long as there are instruments to listen and eyes to see what the sound reveals. The Atlantic has been hiding in plain sight. Sonar is lifting the veil, and what lies beneath is more complex, more active, more alive, and more mysterious than anything we had imagined. The sonar data from the Atlantic constitute a portrait of a world that is simultaneously ancient and dynamic, stable and violent, familiar and alien. The mid-Atlantic ridge has been spreading for roughly 180 million years, according to scientific estimates, creating new oceanic crust at a rate of roughly 2 to 3 centimeters per year. The abyssal plains have been accumulating sediment for millions of years, building up the flattest surfaces on the planet grain by grain, particle by particle. The hydrothermal vent systems have been pumping hot, chemically enriched fluids into the deep water for as long as the spreading has continued, sustaining biological communities that exist in total independence from the sun. These processes are ancient in their origins, but active in their current operation. The ridge is spreading now. The sediment is accumulating now. The vents are pumping now. The organisms are feeding, reproducing, and evolving now. The Atlantic floor is not a museum of past geological events. It is a living, active, continuously changing landscape that is as dynamic today as it has ever been. The sonar data capture snapshots of this dynamic landscape, frozen in the moment of the survey, but the landscape itself never freezes. It continues to change between surveys, producing new features, destroying old ones, and maintaining the complexity that makes every new survey a source of surprise. The acoustic dimension of this dynamic landscape is equally active. The sounds that sonar captures in the deep Atlantic, the rumbles and cracks and calls and drones and sweeps that propagate through the SOFAR channel, are the acoustic expressions of the geological, biological and physical processes that operate on the Atlantic floor. They are the voices of the ridge, the ice, the whales, the storms, and the unidentified sources that have resisted classification. They are continuous, changing, and inexhaustible, produced by an ocean that has been making sounds for as long as it has existed, and that will continue to make them for as long as water fills the basin. What sonar has captured beneath the Atlantic is disturbing, because it reveals the scale of what we do not know about the ocean we have been crossing for 5 centuries. The floor is more complex than any model has predicted. The biology is more diverse than any inventory has captured. The acoustics are more rich than any catalogue has represented. And the unmapped, unsurveyed, unmonitored fraction, the 75% that no multi-beam sonar has touched, is the vast, dark, unknown remainder in which the Atlantic keeps whatever secrets it has not yet revealed. The sonar will continue to map, the hydrophones will continue to listen, the submersibles will continue to descend, and the Atlantic will continue to surprise, because its complexity exceeds every framework built to describe it, its activity exceeds every monitoring system deployed to track it, and its secrets exceed every investigation mounted to reveal them. The Atlantic has been hiding in plain sight, beneath the most crossed surface on the planet, beneath the shipping lanes and the fishing grounds and the cable routes and the military patrol zones, holding its features in the darkness and the pressure and the cold, waiting not for discovery but simply existing as it has always existed, in the deep. Sonar lifts the veil. What lies beneath is more than we imagined. It has always been more, and it will continue to be more, for as long as there are instruments to listen and eyes to see what the sound reveals. The acoustic detection of whale populations in the Atlantic provides a case study in how sonar and acoustic monitoring can serve conservation goals that would be unachievable through visual observation alone. The North Atlantic right whale, one of the most endangered large whale species on the planet, with a population estimated at fewer than 400 individuals, produces distinctive calls that can be detected by hydrophones deployed along the species' migratory route. Acoustic monitoring of right whale calls provides real-time data on the whale's location that is used to implement ship speed restrictions in areas where whales are present, reducing the risk of ship strikes, which are one of the leading causes of right whale mortality. The acoustic monitoring program for North Atlantic right whales is one of the most successful applications of ocean acoustic technology to conservation management and demonstrates the practical value of the monitoring infrastructure that sonar and hydrophone networks provide. The deep-sea ecosystems of the Atlantic, including the hydrothermal vent communities, the cold water coral reefs, the sponge grounds, and the seamount communities, represent a form of biological wealth that is measured not in economic terms but in ecological terms. The species that inhabit these ecosystems include organisms that are found nowhere else on the planet, organisms whose biochemistry includes adaptations to extreme conditions that may have applications in biotechnology, medicine, and materials science. The pressure-stable proteins of deep-sea organisms, the heat-resistant enzymes of hydrothermal vent microbes, and the chemical compounds produced by deep-sea sponges and corals are all potential resources for biotechnology. But exploiting these resources requires knowing where the organisms are, and knowing where they are requires the sonar mapping and biological sampling that have been conducted at only a fraction of the potential locations. The ethical dimension of Atlantic exploration touches on questions of responsibility and stewardship that are becoming increasingly urgent as human activities extend into the deep ocean. Bottom trawling is destroying cold water coral reefs before they can be mapped and protected. Deep-sea mining threatens hydrothermal vent ecosystems before they can be characterized and assessed. Anthropogenic noise is degrading the acoustic environment before it can be comprehensively documented. Plastic pollution has been found at the bottom of the Puerto Rico Trench, more than 8,000 meters below the surface, in one of the most remote environments on the planet. In each case, The human impact is reaching environments faster than the scientific surveys that would document the baseline conditions and assess the damage. The precautionary principle, the principle that action should be taken to prevent environmental harm even when the scientific evidence is incomplete, is directly relevant to the management of the deep Atlantic. The evidence is incomplete because the surveys have not been done. The surveys have not been done because the funding has not been provided. The funding has not been provided because the political priority has not been established. And the political priority has not been established because the public awareness of the deep Atlantic's ecological importance has not reached the level that would generate political pressure for action. The sonar data from the Atlantic have the potential to change this dynamic because they provide the visual evidence of what lies beneath the surface, evidence that can be communicated to the public in maps, images, and videos that make the invisible visible. The multi-beam maps of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, with their volcanic peaks and rift valleys and transform faults, are as dramatic as any terrestrial landscape. The images of the Lost City hydrothermal towers, rising 60 meters from the seafloor in a forest of white carbonate columns, are as striking as any natural wonder on land. The recordings of whale calls propagating through the SOFAR channel, the rumbles of submarine eruptions, and the unexplained acoustic anomalies carry an emotional weight that statistics and maps cannot convey. These visual and acoustic data have the power to create the public awareness that is needed to generate political support for increased investment in Atlantic exploration. The data exist. The stories they tell are compelling. The case for action is strong. What is needed is the communication, the sustained, effective, multi-platform communication that connects the scientific discoveries to the public consciousness, and that translates scientific interest into political priority. The Atlantic has been crossed by ships for 500 years. It has been fought over, fished, mined, polluted, and exploited. It has been the highway of empires, the graveyard of ships, and the medium through which the modern world was built. And through all of this, its flaw has remained hidden, known only to the instruments that probe it with sound and the researchers who analyze the data that the sound returns. The Atlantic's secrets are not dramatic in the way of a thriller or a horror film. They are dramatic in the way of a slowly revealed truth, a truth about the scale of what we do not know, the complexity of what we have not investigated, and the vulnerability of what we have not protected. The sonar continues to map, the hydrophones continue to listen, the discoveries continue to accumulate, and the Atlantic, patient and deep and vast, continues to hold more than we have found, more than we have heard, and more than we have imagined. What sonar captured beneath the Atlantic will disturb you, not because of any single discovery, but because of the cumulative weight of all the discoveries, and because of the vastly greater weight of all that has not yet been discovered. The known is disturbing. The unknown is more disturbing still, and the Atlantic, the most crossed ocean on the planet, holds both in its darkness, beneath its surface, in the deep. The acoustic monitoring of the Atlantic's seismic activity provides another practical application that underscores the value of the monitoring infrastructure. The Atlantic Basin contains several seismically active zones, including the subduction zone beneath the Caribbean, the transform faults along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and the Azores-Gibraltar fault zone in the eastern Atlantic. Earthquakes in these zones have produced destructive tsunamis in the historical record, including the 1755 Lisbon earthquake and tsunami, one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in European history. The acoustic monitoring of seismic activity in the Atlantic, through SOSUS hydrophones and supplementary instruments, provides data that complement the seismic monitoring network and that can detect submarine events that are too small to be recorded by distant seismometers, but large enough to produce significant acoustic emissions in the ocean. The detection of submarine landslides through acoustic monitoring is particularly relevant to tsunami hazard assessment. Submarine landslides can generate tsunamis that are not preceded by the characteristic seismic signals of tectonic earthquakes, making them more difficult to detect and warn against using seismic monitoring alone. Acoustic monitoring provides an additional detection channel that can identify submarine landslides from their distinctive acoustic signatures, potentially providing early warning of tsunami generation. The 1929 Grand Banks event, in which a submarine landslide generated a tsunami that killed 28 people in Newfoundland, demonstrated the reality of this hazard in the Atlantic, and sonar surveys of the Atlantic continental margins have identified conditions similar to those that preceded the Grand Banks event at multiple locations. The monitoring of submarine cable routes by sonar provides economic as well as safety justifications for continued investment in Atlantic sonar capability. The Atlantic is crossed by more than 400 submarine telecommunications cables that carry the majority of intercontinental data traffic between North America and Europe. The routes of these cables are surveyed by multi-beam sonar before installation, and periodic resurveys are conducted to check for changes in the seafloor conditions along the route. Submarine landslides, volcanic activity, earthquake-induced ground deformation, and turbidity currents can all damage cables, disrupting communications that carry billions of dollars of financial transactions daily. The sonar data that characterize the geological hazards along cable routes are essential for risk assessment and for the planning of cable repair operations when damage occurs. The deep Atlantic also plays a role in the global monitoring of nuclear weapons tests, a security application that has contributed to the maintenance of the SOSUS network. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization operates a global network of monitoring stations, including underwater hydroacoustic stations in the Atlantic that detect the acoustic signatures of nuclear explosions. The hydroacoustic stations provide detection capability for submarine nuclear tests that might not be detected by the seismic or infrasound monitoring networks. The maintenance of this monitoring capability provides an additional justification for the continued operation of hydrophone networks in the deep Atlantic, a justification that is independent of the scientific interest in ocean acoustics. The multiple applications of sonar and acoustic monitoring in the Atlantic, from scientific discovery to conservation management to hazard assessment to telecommunication security to nuclear test monitoring, provide a collectively compelling case for sustained investment. No single application taken alone may justify the full cost of comprehensive Atlantic monitoring. Together, they justify investment that far exceeds the current level, because the infrastructure that serves one application simultaneously serves all the others. The multi-beam sonar that maps the seafloor for cable routing also reveals the geological features that produce acoustic anomalies. The hydrophones that monitor whale populations also detect submarine eruptions. The acoustic stations that monitor nuclear tests also record the unexplained events that haunt the researchers. The monitoring infrastructure is a shared resource whose value is the sum of all its applications. The Atlantic has been the most important ocean in human history. It has carried the traffic of civilizations, the communications of nations, and the resources of economies. It continues to do so today, with more ships, more cables, more economic activity, and more strategic importance than any other ocean basin. And yet its floor, the solid surface beneath the water on which the ships sail and the cables rest, is less well known than the surface of a planet that no human has visited. The disparity between the economic importance of the Atlantic and the scientific knowledge of its floor is the most disturbing statistic of all, more disturbing than any individual sonar discovery, more disturbing than any acoustic anomaly, because it represents a systematic, decades-long failure to invest in the understanding of the environment on which so much depends. What sonar has captured beneath the Atlantic is a beginning. It is the first draft of a portrait that will take decades to complete, painted one survey at a time, one acoustic recording at a time, one discovery at a time. The portrait is already more complex, more detailed, and more surprising than anyone expected when the first echo sounder was lowered into the Atlantic a century ago, and it will continue to grow more complex, more detailed, and more surprising with every survey that follows, because the Atlantic is larger than our knowledge, deeper than our instruments, and richer than our models, and it will remain so for as long as the ocean exists, and for as long as there are people curious enough to send sound into the deep and listen for what comes back. The discovery of oceanic core complexes on the mid-Atlantic ridge deserves a final note because it illustrates how sonar transforms understanding. Before multi-beam mapping revealed these dome-shaped features, the standard model of oceanic crust formation held that the crust was created symmetrically at the ridge axis, with equal amounts of new material added to each side. The oceanic core complexes showed that this mode